It's also, so as a side note, quite nice timing to be talking about this because it's Earth Day today. Um, and I'll also give an overview of the theology of creation and on creation and non-violence, linking that to our reading, and we'll have our usual time for discussion. Begin with, we will just begin in prayer, and we'll start with a prayer from Laudato Si, remembering Pope Francis. I'll share my screen. Would anyone like to volunteer to read?
I'll read a few.
Amazing, thank you. Right, I'll share my screen with you. Can you see that okay?
Yes,
Perfect, thank you.
Okay, will I start?
Yes, please, yeah.
All-powerful God, you are present in the whole universe and in the smallest of your creatures. You embrace with your tenderness all that exists. Pour out upon us the power of your love, that we may protect life and beauty. Fill us with peace, that we may live as brothers and sisters, harming no one. O God of the poor, help us to rescue the abandoned and forgotten of this earth, so precious in your eyes. Bring healing to our lives, that we may protect the world and not prey on it, that we may sow beauty, not pollution and destruction. Touch the hearts of those who look only for gain at the expense of the poor and the earth. Teach us to discover the worth of each thing, to be filled with awe and contemplation, to recognize that we are profoundly united with every creature as we journey towards your infinite light. We thank you for being with us each day. Encourage us, we pray, in our struggle for justice, love, and peace. Lord Jesus, you have called Pope Francis to yourself. Thank you for the gift of his papacy. When he was with us, he tirelessly showed the Church your constant mercy towards sinners. Grant him now your mercy, and let him rest eternally with you in your kingdom. Through Christ our Lord. Amen.
Amen. Thank you so much, Owen, for leading us in prayer. So we'll move on to reflection, just as we've done before. So we'll think about anything that has struck us about non-violence or violence since our last meeting, any new insights that you'd like to share. I'd also like to invite us as well, if there's anything that we'd like to share about Pope Francis, and maybe also thinking about anything on his work on non-violence as well that we'd like to share today.
Yeah. No, mine is a sadness that he was never able to give the encyclical on non-violence that I'd hope might be possible.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Jane.
Sorry,
Yeah.
I think it was very powerful that on Sunday, his
Mm-hmm.
almost his last words to us were for peace and to bring peace to Ukraine and to Gaza. And I think that surely must reflect onwards into whatever happens next, whoever comes next must keep that in mind.
Yeah, thanks, Marianne. I think that really struck me as well, actually, and just how powerful those statements were as well. Yeah.
I was also struck by his insistence right to the end on simplicity as best any pope could ever do, right to where he wants to be buried, and the instructions that he gave for that. And I think I don't think he could have done anything more. I mean, we could all do more, but he really gave life to making the church a more welcoming place. And insofar as I can see, he was absolutely for peace and constantly calling for it and in touch with the Christian church in Gaza. And, you know, anyway, all I'm saying is that in a kind of a way, it's his death is almost a cause for celebration, like to celebrate his life. I mean, I know we have to mourn, and it's a massive, massive loss, but he gave so much. And I remember I'm sure like everybody else, I remember the thrilling news of his appointment. And that excitement, for me anyway, he sustained that right through the papacy.
Yeah, thanks, Garrett. I think also that point that you were making as well about sort of right up until the end, I think just that process of accompaniment, he didn't really give up on that, whether it was with going to meet people or still going out onto the balcony or still being in touch with the Christians in Gaza. And that's really quite amazing, actually, isn't it? Right up until the end.
I've been really touched with how many people across such a different spectrum of views and just the population of believers, non-believers have found a message with him that maybe other popes haven't been able to reach. And I found that really hopeful. I found, you know, so often there's such negative news about the church and about religion and about Christianity. And I've heard so many positive things, and so many people have come up to me as well. And I just found it really nice to see that our Catholic faith going beyond the walls of just the church. I felt like he really took it out and brought that message of the gospel alive in so many different ways through words and actions, and a world hungry to see that, and maybe not realizing how much he touched them at the time. But I've heard so many nice comments, and I just think it's really nice. It's nice to see how far he reached beyond the traditional Catholics.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think a lot of the really nice tributes that I've read have been from people of other religions or none, sort of in wider media, but also my friends as well, of people I wouldn't necessarily expect. And I think that's quite remarkable, isn't it, that you have it sort of, that reach, and that people recognize that as well.
But always very true to the faith and keeping it grounded in the gospel. And I just think it's really very, very nice.
Then anything else anyone else would like to share?
I don't know whether it's significant at all, but some of the things I've been reading this week in relation to how effective, in a sense, he's been as a leader, which suggests to me that he certainly has a draw on young people. And looking at the crowds that are going into St. Peter's, the number of them who are young people is really superb. And I was again listening to one of the commentators who was suggesting that In fact, the opposite was happening in terms of the numbers of people being attracted to the Catholic Church. That would appear to suggest that's not the case. And I know that my own daughters who don't practice the faith, both of them were really touched by him and by how he led his life. You know, I still have hope for them that they'll take the steps necessary. But yeah, you know, that I think he was a marvelous man.
Yeah, thanks, Evan. Would anyone else like to share? Anne, did you want to say something?
Thank you. I'm sorry I'm a bit late joining you. About Pope Francis, I don't think he got everything right, but then I don't think any of us get everything right. But I think the crucial thing for me was that he was inclusive, that he was very, very clear that everybody has a value and a worth, and especially people who who are marginalized because of poverty. And he had a place for people who think differently. I admire the fact that he consistently reached across faith divides and to contact and dialogue with people from different points of view. And the other thing is that he woke people up to the danger facing our planet, really, you know, with Laudato Si, and the fact that we need to work together in order to make our world environmentally safe again, really. And then also the last thing really I'd say for me is that I admire the way that he didn't overestimate his own worth, that he prepared for a time when he wouldn't be there, and he thought about, you know, the kind of people that were going to be his successors, and he appointed new cardinals who would sort of be not from one place in the world, but sort of, you know, worldwide representatives, really. And I think in that way he was a good leader, because he didn't overestimate his own value, and I think that's really important, actually. And you know, that's for me what makes a good leader, when you know when it's time to bow out, and when you prepare for what's going to happen after you're not there anymore. So yeah, he didn't get everything right, but he did an awful lot of things right.
Thanks, Anne. Anything else that anyone would like to add? Well, thank you so much, everyone, for sharing. And I suppose it is sort of strange timing going through this today, but hopefully we can sort of think about the legacy of Pope Francis as we're going through these topics today. So I'll just, for the rest of the session, I'll begin by talking a little bit about violence in the environment and just some of the interconnections there. And then we'll think a bit more about some of the theology behind this within the church, so the ideas of care for creation within Catholic social teaching. And then I'll look more at Laudato Si and some of what Pope Francis has taught us about creation and non-violence as well. And then we'll have a bit of time, take a break for a bit of time for discussion. So last time we were looking at Christology, and within that we were thinking about concepts of the fall and ideas within salvation history. And we'll think about this today kind of really as a sort of a background for everything that we're talking about, thinking about how this links to our relationship with the earth. So when we're thinking about the concept of the fall, so humanity turning away from living in a way that God intends them to, and thinking about how this causes corruption on the social level, we can also see how this links to the environmental level. So not only is this causing social division amongst each other, but also division between humanity and the earth. When we're thinking about issues of violence, we see those divisions between the earth and humanity as inherently connected. And I think that's something that Pope Francis has really emphasised throughout his papacy. And we can see that especially, not limited to, but especially in the example of militarism, which I'll talk a little bit more about today. So as well as the humanitarian devastation that's caused by war, we can also see militarism as hugely damaging to the earth. So global conflict has caused lots of areas to become uninhabitable and infertile through the use of bombs or landmines, pollution, the destruction of forests and animal habitats. And some prominent examples of that include things like the use of Agent Orange in the Vietnam War, which caused defoliation, or the pollution caused through oil spills in the first Gulf War. We could also think about Gaza today, and I think the estimate was something like it would take 15 years to clean up the debris. Even when not engaged in direct conflict, the military still has a hugely negative impact on the environment. The Conflict and Environment Observatory estimates that militaries worldwide are responsible for about 5.5% of global emissions. But that doesn't include emissions during wartime, which are very, very hard to measure and people don't necessarily keep track of. So it may well be higher than that as well. Also, military emission reporting is not currently compulsory in lots of countries. So that means the military has lagged behind as well in addressing their emissions. So again, that 5.5% may well be an underestimate. Military preparations in the arms trade also have a substantial impact on climate change through the use of fossil fuels, plundering of natural resources, the destruction of habitats. And we can see the damage of this, for example, in the plundering of natural resources in Chile, Peru, and the Amazon for use in US-backed military bases in South Korea. The testing and manufacture of nuclear weapons as well also adds a destructive element. Often the debates around nuclear weapons frame on the issue as a danger to our future, but we can see that actually nuclear testing alone has a devastating impact, so contaminating water and land with radioactive waste, and that can affect the environment for up to 100,000 years. And we see that in the aftermath of the Bikini Atoll tests, which really decimated the land, the water, so obviously affecting the environment, but also the population that lived there and their food sources. Also linked to this, we can see conflict is driven through access to resources, so to fossil fuels, but also to food and water. So we can see that, for example, in illegal mining funded by armed groups in the Congo or the Taliban in Afghanistan, but also just more broadly to do with resources and competition for resources as climate loss and biodiversity loss, etc., sort of make those resources more scarce. According to the Ecological Threat Register in 2020, the 19 countries with the highest number of ecological threats were also amongst the least peaceful countries in the world. So you can really see how that's tied together. And by 2040, it's estimated that a total of 5.4 billion people are expected to live in countries facing extreme water shortages. And about the same amount are projected to live in food insecurity by 2050. So you can see how that might lead to things like mass displacement, the competition of resources, increased civil unrest, political instability, etc. So that was, I know that was quite a lot to digest, but we'll come back to talk about it in our discussion. But just to talk a little bit about how this relates to Catholic social teaching and some of the issues that are touched on in the book. So within Catholic social teaching, care for creation has been developing as an increasingly central concern from the 1970s. So we see this in Paul the Sixth Apostolic letter Octogesima Adveniens, and he addresses environmental concerns and roots this in the biblical tradition. And Paul II develops these themes in his writings in a number of encyclicals. And again, he draws on the creation narratives and emphasizes traditional concepts such as the special task of stewardship for creation granted to humanity, how humanity expresses the image of God through participating in his creative work. And again, in Centesimus Animus, he uses Genesis 5 to affirm that the earth is God's gift to the whole of the human family. And that's reiterated by Benedict in his encyclicals as well. So that's the idea of the universal destination of goods. So the earth is for all of us to share. It's not to be hoarded or plundered by particular groups or elites. So we can think about this also as an issue of systematic injustice. And one example of that would be richer nations monopolizing resources that are meant to be distributed equally. So seeing how selfishness and greed of more affluent countries can affect those in less wealthy nations, and the impacts of that can cause migration, displacement, which perpetuates this crisis and causes it to continue. We can also see how often the response to displacement is not necessarily understanding or acceptance. It might be violence, it might be marginalization, trying to protect resources that we already have, or ones that we want to gain. So really perpetuating this cycle. It's also worth thinking about some of the criticisms that have been levelled at Catholic theology and Catholic social teaching as well. So one of the main criticisms here is that it's been critiqued for being too anthropocentric. So focusing on how environmental damage affects humanity, rather than looking at the value of nature in its own right, and focusing too much on human stewardship, rather than this idea of the significance of the incarnation for the whole world. And one of the most famous examples of this, or sort of one of the key essays that starts this critique, was by Lynn White in 1967. And he really spoke about the Christian tradition as the root of ecological crisis, depending on a particular reading of Genesis that perpetuates this idea of domination over the earth. So it's worth keeping that in mind as we're going along to sort of think about some of those critiques in the tradition. Increasingly, though, we are seeing a recognition within Catholic teaching that we can't separate out care for each other and care for creation, and this idea of the value of creation. And we really do see that in Pope Francis' Laudato Si. And this is the first social encyclical to really seriously address humanity's relationship with the wider environment in a sustained way. So in Laudato Si, Pope Francis draws on the creation narratives in which Adam and Eve are banished from the garden, and demonstrates how our relationships with God, with each other, and creation are ruptured through sin. So these three key relationships. And he says that this originally harmonious relationship between human beings and nature becomes conflictual. He then reflects on the story of Cain and Abel, which we've spoken about in some of our earlier sessions. And here illustrates how violence towards each other and the earth is linked. So he says, here we see how envy led Cain to commit the ultimate injustice against his brother, which in turn ruptured the relationship between Cain and God, and between Cain and the earth from which he was banished. So here we can see how violence towards the other creates unjust structural systems that oppress humanity, but also oppress the earth. And Pope Francis speaks about violence being present in our hearts, wounded by sin, being reflected in the symptoms of sickness evident in the soil, in the water, in the air, and in all forms of life. The root of this, Francis, is really clear to denounce what he talks about as a technocratic mindset that views the world in terms of its usefulness for consumption by humanity, speaking of nature rather as having its own value in God's eyes. So it has its own value independently of humanity. And aware of Christianity's role in perpetuating this myth of human domination that I was talking about, he insists that nowadays we most forcefully reject the notion that our being created in God's image and being given dominion over the earth justifies absolute domination over other creatures. And the Bible has no place for a tyrannical anthropocentrism. So this is really quite key, because he's, and in Laudato Deum as well, he really reiterates this in quite punchy language of calling out where the church has denied due care to the earth as well, or where theology has perhaps gone a bit astray. And sorry, go on.
Sorry, what the Bible? I didn't catch the end of the sentence, and you said it was really important. The Bible has
no place for a tyrannical anthropocentrism.
Thank you.
So that idea of it isn't about unlimited human domination for over the earth. We don't have unlimited dominion over the earth. And quite unusually, Pope Francis also uses scientific research in his encyclicals, which is to really back up these claims that he's making about the environment, and that's quite unusual as well, that he's relying on scientists too. So what I might actually just close the window because it is a little bit noisy, and that might be why you can't hear it. Okay, hopefully that's better. So what happens within Laudato Si and the roots of this theology within creation that Pope Francis gives us is that it allows him to develop ideas of anthropology and Christology that work together. So he states that every element of creation gives glory to God by their very existence. So here a value is placed on creation through God's love for it, not its usefulness, not its links to humanity. And that God's loving plan in which every creature has its own value and significance. And that situates the whole of creation within God's plan. The whole of creation is within salvation history, not just humanity. And we find similar ideas within eco-theology in an idea known as deep incarnation. And this embeds the incarnation within the creation narrative so that Jesus' redemptive work restores the whole of creation, not just humanity. So the incarnation isn't just an affirmation of humanity, but it's also an affirmation of creation, of the natural world, so God becoming embodied within creation. And we see those ideas reflected in Laudato Si in the implications of universal or sublime communion that Pope Francis talks about, and God creating through the Word, so Christ. And therefore everything, humanity and nature alike, finds its origin but also its ultimate destiny in Christ. In his 2017 World Day of Peace message, Pope Francis talks about non-violence as a style of politics for peace. And here he includes the devastation of the environment as an act of violence, as well as the injustice of resources being channeled into militarism and away from those who really need them. So denying that universal destination of goods and using them to promote warfare or violence instead of going to help those who really need them. And Francis develops this thinking in terms of what he calls an integral ecology. So this shows how injustice amongst humanity and injustice towards the earth are really inherently intertwined. So the cry of the earth, the cry of the poor are inherently linked. What harms the earth harms us, and vice versa. So this view of integral ecology links the care of the natural world with justice for the poor and vulnerable. And for Francis, this is part of a larger cultural crisis. It's a moral problem, it's a moral crisis, not just something purely physical. So it's not that it just calls for a material response or changing perhaps what types of energy we use, but it's also a complete change of mentality. And this is where his calls to ecological conversion become really central. So linking back to earlier when Pope Francis talking about the relationships between God, the earth and neighbour, he talks about how human life is really grounded in these fundamental and closely intertwined relationships. And each of these needs to be readdressed to work towards sustainable peace and justice. So readdressing our relationship with the earth, with our neighbour, and also with God. Here as well, an essential part of realising our own dignity is by realising that of creation. And he talks about this need to learn to encounter God in creatures outside ourselves. And that's really important too, because it's through the world, through God's creation, that we journey towards God. That's how we sort of learn as humans. We're interacting in the world the entire time. So we further realise our own personhood and relationship with God, not just from relationships with each other, but also with our relationships with creation. So through encounter, through that deeper understanding and contemplation on creation, we also realise what it means to be human. And it's important here to think about this act of creation. And we can see this act as inherently one that's non-violent. So it stems from this outpouring of divine love. It's coming from a relational Godhead made up of a reciprocal communion of three persons whose love is shared with all of creation. Humanity then is made in that image of God. So our true humanity is called to reflect that reciprocal loving relationship. And what that means is violence towards each other and also violence towards the earth is really a misunderstanding of what it means to be human. It's kind of getting it wrong, what it means in our anthropology. Francis talks about this in his 2017 World Day of Peace message. And he talks about nonviolence as a strategy that's offered to us by Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount and exemplified in the crucifixion. So that violence encountered in the world being met with that unconditional, non-violent love of God. For Francis, concern for the environment thus needs to be joined to a sincere love for our fellow human beings and an unwavering commitment to resolving the problems of society. Asserting that a deep communion with the rest of nature cannot be real if our hearts lack tenderness, compassion, and concern for our fellow human beings. So what I think this really points to is when we're thinking about moving forward in this environmental crisis, we really need to be thinking about our relationship with the earth, but also our relationship with each other, and thinking about this solidarity and cooperation. So we can't restore harmony to the earth if we don't have harmony amongst ourselves and vice versa. So without this, and as we've sort of spoken about at the beginning of those examples of militarism, the climate crisis only gets exacerbated by violence, and it only exacerbates violence through that battle of resources. And as Pope Francis talks about in Laudato Si, we require a new and universal solidarity to try and move forward to address these issues. And I think really we can see that as marked by a holistic non-violence that extends not just to humanity, but also towards creation. I'm going to pause there. Is there anything anyone wants to ask before we move into group discussion?
Yeah, not so much ask, but if I could comment, because I'm actually perfectly happy with an anthropocentric approach, and I think that as long as you emphasise the stewardship aspects rather than the tyrannical or domination aspects, that you end up working for precisely the same things, both in terms of what to do about climate change and global warming. And so I don't go along with the deep incarnational approach. And I'm also not entirely happy with using the word violence to cover exploitation, destruction of the environment. I prefer a narrower limitation on it that sort of talks about interpersonal relationships rather than one that extends to the physical universe. But I don't think either of those make any difference to the actual practical outworking in terms of concern for opposing wars and working for justice.
Thanks, David. Has anyone else got any thoughts on this?
Got to say, I find so often that violence towards the earth and violence towards other creatures is practiced by those who are violent towards other people. And we have to look at Israeli settlers destroying olive trees, which I find horrific. Killing something totally unnecessary because they want to make a point against Palestinians. Or extractivism, destroying the earth for gain and destroying people that get in the way of it. So the two, unfortunately, tend to get very much linked up with each other.
Yeah, thanks, Chris.
Yes, we're seeing huge violence going on in southern and sub-Saharan Africa in relation to extraction of minerals, and that has been there for some time, but it's increasing, and the violence is exacerbated by European companies and Chinese companies, which are involved in the extraction. So I think that we have to keep that very much in mind, that it's totally linked together, as Grace says.
I tend to see violence as a spectrum, really, and that if you have an attitude of mind that you think it's okay just to devastate an environment or devastate animal life, then probably you don't really have much idea of your responsibility to care for people. You know, that's my simplistic idea, I suppose.
Yeah, thanks, Sam. I think part of it is, for me, I would say, I think it's very hard to separate out, because I think if you're doing nuclear testing, for example, you might not necessarily be directly violent to people, but if you're then destroying habitat or resources or land, or you're causing displacement, I think that is very violent. But I think I'd also want to extend it to say there's a destruction of God's creation, which is humanity, but also goes beyond that.
But Anna, I mean, the question is whether the word something can be wrong without being violent. And I do think it's sort of tricky, because if you're part of an in-group and you think you are superior and it's all right to do horrible nasties to the other, I mean, if you're a Nazi in Nazi Germany, you can be very good to your sort of pets and your sort of livestock, and at the same time be killing Jews. And extraction, I mean, if you Norway, you can cope with extracting fossil fuels without it having a detrimental impact on poverty and security. Or even if you're strong enough, public authority out in Botswana, you can cope with discovering diamonds and using them. But if you're in the Congo, then you just haven't any effective public authority. And that sort of means that private companies can run haywire on it.
Mm.
So it's
But,
not so much the extraction; it's the social political setting in which it takes place. I mean, discuss.
yeah, I mean, I think I don't know what other people would think, but I think I would probably push that a bit further, because I think the extraction of resources and that kind of degradation, it does harm people globally, but also intergenerationally, even if it's generations yet to come. I think you're depriving people. There's that deprivation element as well, I think. So yeah, I think what you're saying about anthropocentrism is a very tricky one, and I think it's actually very hard to not be at least somewhat anthropocentric when we're discussing this. But I think what Pope Francis is trying to do in Laudato Si is push us further to include it's both, it's both and they are really completely interconnected. So I think actually the questions really kind of relate to what you raised. So I'll put those in the chat. So it's thinking about, how do we understand environmental violence? How do we think that relates to theology? And maybe if we want to think of the role of the church within that. And what do we think theology is of creation? Tell us about violence and non-violence. And then I've included a couple of quotes here from the book that might just be helpful when we're thinking through those messages, those questions. So I'll pop that in the chat now. I think we have maybe sort of 10 minutes, maybe slightly longer in our groups, and then we'll come back and discuss. And then if we have time, we'll think about the case studies, but I think we'll see how we're getting on. So into the breakout rooms. Okay, should be open now. Marion, I think you can join one, but you might have to add yourself as your co-host.
Has Rosalind been added to a group?
Mm-hmm.
Right. How do I get in the group again?
If you just click on the breakout rooms, then you can just click join.
Okay.
You found it?
Yeah, I'm making decisions.
Do you want me to make a start with that, Anna? And then if anybody else wants, because nobody else is volunteering, is that
perfect? Thank you.
I'm happy to sort of share it with people though. Okay. We were talking about, let me see, Garrett was talking about the relationship between environmental violence and
development.
So I better be developmental violence and development, that's right. and people's need for employment that was, you know, that was bringing devastation of places as a result. No, I'm just having, I can't read my writing, sorry. And Owen said that we're fed with information nowadays, but who benefits from that? Few benefit, actually. He brought up the idea, you know, people don't change. Alexander the Great, who took over vast areas of land, you know, and then during the slave trade, people were used as a commodity. There's a kind of exploitative nature of humanity. Grace mentioned, you know, the T-man, the Trump man, who wants Greenland and Ukraine, and we all agreed, I think, that there's just a sort of greed in all of that. And Owen talked about in Nigeria the attack on Christian churches over many years now, and 20,000 Christians have been murdered over economic matters. Oh, and then Garrett mentioned the greed, and as I think he meant it really in Ireland, the 17 billion in extra taxes over the last year or so, and no one said we shouldn't take this for ourselves. That, you know, maybe it was actually exploiting people in other countries that were paying the taxes. So yeah, that's what I've noted anyway. I don't know if anyone else wants to add a bit extra to that.
Well, I think you brought up a very good point, and I think I started this particular hero running by talking about what children are looking forward to being, and nowadays it's about being influencers or being rich, and that got on to what are children seeing on the internet and what are they seeing on their phones and social media, and a lot of violence is coming from there that perhaps we were only scraping the surface of.
Yeah.
So there was a conversation going that started on that, which could last for a long time.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think we're sort of thinking linked to that, about that disconnect with nature as well.
Yeah.
And the impacts of that. Yeah. Thanks, Anne. That was a very good summary.
Speaking about the need to protect young people from smartphones.
Yeah.
To encourage parents and teachers to ban them for people, say, under 15 or under, you know.
Yeah, thanks, Garrett. Room 2, would anyone like to give us a summary?
I wrote some notes, so I'm happy to do that.
Thanks, Jill.
But I would just comment on your last comment, because I am a teacher in a primary school and I work with the children who are non-engagers. And it's really heartbreaking just to see how they've really been taken in with this. You know, I work specifically, I'm not saying all children and all families, but a lot of the parents are so much on their scrolling and not spending time with them. And I don't know how, as a society, without being really judgy and being, you know, holier than thou, to find a way to support parents to get back into nature and to get back to, you know, playing old-fashioned games and just talking with their children. But it is a crisis that's probably not spoken about enough, I would say, from my experience. But that's not, I find it really interesting because these topics are so deep and wide. We spoke about none of that, all completely. We just went in a completely different direction, which was also very fruitful. So anyway, so we started going back to anthropocentric nature of and stewardship, and just talking about how Adam was told to safeguard, you know, the world, and really given that responsibility to look after the world. And then we just talked about how the two creation stories at the beginning with the 7 days of creation and then Adam and Eve are really different, and how peaceful the first one really was, putting the humans on the 6th day. And whereas in Adam and Eve, it was really from the beginning about you know, what did I say? Just, you know, deception was kind of part of it right from the beginning. And Marion mentioned that at the time when that was written, the stories were written, it just is also a reflection of maybe what those societies were already a part of that society. We talked about using the word violence in ecological destruction, and how maybe it's not always a violent action that leads to destruction, like pollution, some of the pictures, images we can see, but like slowly just, you know, I use the example of, we used to all be organic farmers, and then chemicals came, you know, we slipped into it, maybe not in a violent way, but it has become, and we talked about really about greed and self-aggrandizement, and just how we've gotten this way in this world, but really how now it's culpable negligence if we claim that we don't know our actions are not causing the destruction that they are. And Marion gave a good example of, I believe it was in Zambia, just using DDT and using things that we know in our chemicals that we know are banned in our country. Still, companies or organizations already feel that they can use those in other countries, even though we know the damage that the chemicals can do. And then we kind of had a discussion about how theology and church, how many people that we know don't make that association, that the role of the church is, and the theology, the Catholic social teaching is so much about caring for the environment, caring for the integral ecology, excuse me, and how so many people we don't know how to get everyone in the pews in the congregation to be seeing that link, because it's not always apparent. And Marion pointed out that maybe more non-Catholics have read Laudato Si than Catholics, and we come across so many people in our organizations and networks that aren't even Catholic that have read it and know and are grateful to Pope Francis for speaking out. But many Sunday Catholics that we know just think that maybe isn't the role that they see the church should be in, and we have a lot of work to do to try to build up that. And let's see, I think that's, let's see. And we just then spoke again about how environmental issues are causing great migrations, and with drought and, you know, things to come, this is just going to be an ongoing issue that we just need to really take responsibility for. So others,
Thanks so much, Jen. Thank you.
Yes, and how conflicts and war can cause profound environmental damage, and how profound environmental problems like food and water and that can lead to violent conflict. I think Jan put that very well.
Thank you, David. Did anyone else want to add anything? Oh, Owen, I think you're on mute, Owen.
The thing about people in the pews not knowing or wanting to know, but I like that bit in the textbook where in Manila it says they use from the 1st of September to the 4th of October as the time of creation. So you add to Advent and so on. This one just before Advent, which I think would be an excellent idea to.
Do you know, we do have the season of creation here in Scotland as well. The bishops put each of the dioceses probably have one event as well, and we do try to raise awareness during the time. And it is the beginning of September till the 4th of October, which is St. Francis's feast day.
Oh, well, it's not reached me yet.
Okay, well there we go. We've got work to do. But there is season of creation and a care for creation office from the Bishops' Conference. So there we go. We've got work to do.
Yeah, and the Episcopal Church does the same.
Okay.
Thank you. Thanks so much, everyone, for sharing. I think that's a really nice summary of lots of different aspects of this topic. So I think we probably don't have time for another breakout room. What I was going to do, but I will send around the handout, was just look at some of the case studies that we'd read from the book. So the first one was from Colombia, and looking at that idea of militarized commerce, so the use of military service by companies to provide security, and how that was linked to human rights abuses and extractivism. And the example there was land theft by a palm oil corporation and the work of the Christian peacemaker teams in a non-violent campaign against the Body Shop. Then the second one was from the Philippines and looking at the Catholic Relief Services and their work on a communal, local level on conflict over land. And the questions that I thought would be useful to think about here of what types of violence can you see in those examples, both to Earth, to humanity, or how they're interlinked, but also what practices of non-violence and techniques can we see in those case studies, because they give us quite a lot actually, which are really nice, and thinking about how do those relate to some of the theology that we've spoken about as well. And I think people have touched on this as well, but it might be good to think about.
From no backups for 602 days.
Sorry, that's my that's my computer telling me to back up the last 2 years.
There's a very authoritative tone from your computer.
I thought mine was bad enough. That's a record.
Oh dear.
And then last question is just thinking about where else in the church or the world can we see those efforts to combat ecological violence. I think what I will do maybe for the last 10 minutes is just, if anyone wants to share anything on this theme or about any examples from the church and the world that they want to share on this topic, or if there's any sort of other reflections that we want to share about Pope Francis or some of the thinking that's come out of this on Laudato Si, we can maybe just spend the last few minutes going through those things. Does that also sound all right, Marion? Yeah.
I have something quite interesting, and it really it ties in really nicely with both of those themes. And it is that Pope Francis knew that he was getting quite poorly, obviously. And after Laudato Si, he really had this vision that he wanted to make a place. If any of you have seen the letter, you know, he was really passionate about bringing people who were working on climate initiatives and bringing all the different things together. Anyway, in his last year or two, he had this idea that he would like to give up some of the papal summer gardens up in the mountains, Castel Gandolfo, and instead of making them an exclusive use for the popes, I think you probably know, maybe in the last 8 or so years, he opened them up so people could go visit them. But he then had this vision that he wanted to go further, and he wanted to make it a research center and a conference center and a place where people could come together and share ideas to move forward. You know, similar to in the letter, you know, native tribes and scientists and climate activists and whatnot. So he devoted, he had a little team of people working together, has a little team, and they put it into 10 different sections, and they want to have a seed garden from around the world, maybe similar to Kew Gardens. And they want to have a conference center where people can meet, and they want to have apprenticeships where people can learn organic farming. And they've changed, you know, the vineyards and whatnot to make it, they're going to have their own wine so that it can be self-sustaining and use animals from the farm to use the organic natures and just for people to share their techniques. And they're trying to work with universities to do apprenticeships and to just make it a place of learning and exchange of ideas, as well as to have, I think it's called Borgo Laudato Si, which is means village, I think. So Laudato Si village, and maybe some of you are familiar with this, but I got a little bit involved in it last year because my brother was asked to help with the water part of it, because they wanted to recycle water. It's up on the top of this big crater, and they wanted to find ways to better use the water so that they could have a conference center that up to 100 or 150 people could come without having to. And so just using recycled water and using the gray water to drip feed the plants and try to keep the same landscaping. And it was just really his vision to try to get that done in his lifetime before someone could come and claim that land back. So that's just maybe my little connection, that he was so passionate about that he was willing to give up. He still kept there's still part of it that's for future popes. And, you know, Pope Benedict used the other part of the garden, but it was just the part that he really wanted to give back to the people and only have electric vehicles going in there and really be a model of sustainability and integral ecology. So anyway, you can keep your eye on that, but I just thought it's just such a beautiful example of him like living what he really hoped to do. And by having apprenticeships and by having conferences, he really wanted to help other people make that real in their lives and carry it forward. So just thought I would share that with any of you.
Thanks so much, Jill. That's a really lovely example.
The Diocese of Salford have done quite a lot of work in one of their centres on ecology. Not as far as that, but at least the idea. I think the Bishop of Salford is very much into Laudato Si, and has opened up areas of the garden there to be turned into orchards and what have you. So it's worth keeping an eye on that one too.
That's great.
What I did like about the readings we had was it just confirmed something that it struck me yet again during the readings for the Easter Vigil about after the flood, the humans and the animals got to eat more than just the vegetation. And so I thought, my God, they were vegetarians before that, and now it's turned. And of course, one of the readings we had said that was part of the fall. And I thought,
yeah,
it has it was something that was struck me before, but I never quite followed it up. So I found that quite interesting. And it's perhaps something to highlight more than we do.
Right. And it's interesting in Isaiah that when the prophet Isaiah looks forward, he has a picture of the lion lying down with the lamb and everyone eating straw.
Talking about almost like references, I found it strange, one of the references that was given, Judges 13:25 and 15:14-15 as examples of the love of God and the non-violence. I went to read it. It did say that the Spirit had moved on Samson. It was the story of Samson. Yeah, Samson. And he went then immediately after the Spirit had moved him down to find a wife. And then he had created this riddle, and she gave the meaning of it away. And so he kind of lost his bet. So he went off and slaughtered 30 or something people immediately with that. So I thought that whoever put that in, I don't think that was a very appropriate reference to give for the love of God.
The first of the suicide bombers.
Yeah, well, then he went on to kill 1,000 with a jawbone about, or a donkey or whatever it was, in the chapters afterwards. So, not a nice man.
Yeah.
And anything else anyone would like to share?
I still have this concern that it's all very well us talking about these things, but I look at places like America where they just don't seem to have that approach to life. And you think, do they value nature? Particularly if the current government's in. He's cutting back in all the environmental protections and the money going to the national parks. It's one of the biggest countries and one of the ones most influential. How do we get the message over there?
Yeah.
Although our own government seems very determined to take every drop of oil out of out of the North Sea, and
Oh,
you
yes,
know,
and
the
sort of,
environmental damage it's going to be caused by that. And I mean, I'm not saying that Trump et al. In the US are in any way great, but yeah, there's not always great stuff at home either, I'm afraid.
no.
Mm.
I mean, additional airport runways, not pushing ahead with electric vehicles as fast as they could, and the impacts of the massive cut in overseas aid is going to have real environmental knock-ons in many third world countries.
Mm.
But I suppose I tend to sort of take it quite a bit down and say, what can I do to encourage my congregation and the people I could come into contact with? Although Trump's going to have a lot more influence than I have on climate change.
I mean, yeah. I think I suppose what gives me hope is that there are still people trying to do those things. I know a lot of my friends in America are trying to combat that. And I suppose you hope and try and support those voices.
Yeah.
But that's not to deny that a lot of what we're hearing is quite terrifying.
There was one thing that struck me when reading some of the examples was that whole issue of land rights.
Mm-hmm.
It's something that I think in our own country we kind of push to the side, but it's actually really, really important about how we use the land in Scotland or England or whatever, you know. And I think we need to get that much higher up the priority for our politicians. If there's any way that we can do that, just as a general thing about how we use the land that we have.
Sorry, and what Anna was saying about the universal destination of goods is absolutely spot on in terms of land, because it's another case of the commodification, the privatization of what actually are the gifts of God in creation. And you end up with the rich monopolizing resources and the poor getting kicked off the land.
Yeah, thanks, David and Ursula. I think that's a good point. And in both the examples that we've read, it's the already marginalised Indigenous communities as well, isn't it?
Yeah.
Like those who already lack that power. Yeah. Is there anyone else who'd like to add anything before we finish?
Yeah, and just to say thank you for introducing it.
Oh, thank you. Thanks very much, everyone. I thought if people want to, I know we are going a bit over time, we could maybe just finish with another prayer, the canticle from St. Francis. No, this is quite a long one, so I won't force anyone to read. But I will share my screen if you want to follow along. Most high, all-powerful, all-good Lord, all praise is yours, all glory, honour and blessings. To you alone, most high, do they belong. No mortal lips are worthy to pronounce your name. We praise you, Lord, for all your creatures, especially for Brother Sun, who is the day through whom you give us light, and he is beautiful and radiant with great splendour. Of you, most high, he bears your likeness. We praise you, Lord, for Sister Moon and the stars. In the heavens you have made them bright, precious and fair. We praise you, Lord, for brothers wind and air, fair and stormy, all weather's moods, by which you cherish all that you have made. We praise you, Lord, for sister water, so useful, humble, precious, and pure. We praise you, Lord, for Brother Fire, through whom you light the night. He is beautiful, playful, robust, and strong. We praise you, Lord, for Sister Earth, who sustains us with her fruits, coloured flowers, and herbs. We praise and bless you, Lord, and give you thanks, and serve you in all humility. Amen.
Thank you.